All right, so this is a bit of an experiment because we received a notification that StreamYard now allows people to stream to Instagram. I'm gonna have to turn my own volume down because unfortunately it plays back in my own ears. So we're actually gonna play this a little bit differently. Let's do it that way. But as you can tell, as you can see, we are here live. You can the whole reflection in the sunglasses can be weird, but there's 3 things that we're gonna cover in this live stream, and the first one is I want to do a bit of a recap of the cleanup we did this weekend. First of all, anyone who showed up to that, thank you very much. In about an hour and a half, we cleaned basically half of a dumpster's worth of trash out of a valley in what is it? Up here in Tucson, and the turnout was great. Unbroken Co. was there. Finance and Maneuver sent their regards, and I just barely finished cleaning up some of the rifles that we had used. But as you can tell, things are changing here. We're gonna be busy. The Christmas season is upon us, so thank you for joining us in this live stream. I've still got a little bit of that post-workout energy going on, a little bit of We Go Home's pre-workout still pumping through my veins, so if I'm, adding to the vibe, just let me know. We'll figure it out. We got a whole bunch of things to go over today. First, the most important thing to cover off the bat is we're doing a big giveaway at the end of the year, and it is live now. The easiest way to be entered is either be signed up for our Dead Drop newsletter, which gets you 10 free entries, as well as you can head over to our Instagram account because we are getting so close to 10K people on that platform, and that's the goal so that we can reach that milestone in 2023 and carry on bringing good, rigorous philosophy to gun culture and America as we go beyond. Because it is important for us in the time approaching to consider how it is we think about things like violence and rights and responsibilities. But we are live on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, and as a result, we're just playing with all the technology gods today to see what is going to happen. Let's start with the giveaway. All right, so we've got a light eater jacket included. We've got one of our hoodies, a swag bag giveaway, and one of our surprise friend teleportation hats. There's one left in stock, and last shipping goes out for this year at the end of this week. Then there's a couple of other things that are gonna be in there as well. We've got a plate carrier from Arbor Arms. It's gonna be their Minuteman with a shingle, a magazine shingle on the front, as well as 3 different cummerbund options, so you can customize it to your will. There's gonna be a holster by TXC Holsters. It's for a Glock 19, and then we've got, there's more in there that I can't remember. Ooh, a disposable camera just because of the giggles. And then finally, Signal Hill Supply, who was an inspiration for me early on in this whole ordeal, reached out right away, and they decided to throw in something to the loot pile, and that is one of their skate decks with a design on it by Gypsy Walters, someone I like to call friend, so shout out to him. But that is the start. We're doing a giveaway. If you wanna enter into there, you can head over to Instagram, find the link, it's pinned at the top, or find the reel, it's pinned at the top, it's gonna say giveaway on it. You can leave a comment tagging somebody in there, and that will be counted as one entry, no limits. So, fire away, and we will see you guys soon. But the next thing that we want so let's go back to the what did we discover from this weekend? Well, here's gonna be the AAR. We had about 20 people show up, which was fantastic for a last-minute announcement. And yes, it's a distraction, but we'll get to that in a second. We had about 20 people show up, a little bit more, and in about an hour and a half, we pulled about a half a dumpster's worth of trash out of the public land that is commonly used for shooting, and then after that, we had a bit of a range day. Great time, great turnout. And the firearms that we brought out were a Palmetto State Armory Jackal, which got a lot of use. And after cleaning it, the operating system of it certainly likes to handle a suppressor a little bit better than a direct impingement. being expected, and some of the design features really came to play. One of them that I'll talk about at another time, but one of them that we can get into ahead of time is that the location of the charging handle is actually perfectly placed so that if you're shooting your rifle, if you're using the firearm, like in a contemporary setting, it's not so far back that it ruins the point, and it's not so far forward, that it gets in the way of your mechanics. So what I mean by that is if you take the Jackal and you look at it, and I've been playing with this for about a month now. If you take the Jackal and you look at where the non-reciprocating charging handle is located, it's at a perfect location where if it was any further back, it would be sort of indifferent than a normal AR-15 charging handle, and if it was any farther forward, it would be, getting in the way of lights, lasers, or the flip side thermal that we had on there from AGM. So AGM is working or has a thermal. It's a kind of a weapon-mounted style thermal. You could use it in conjunction with nitrogen, but it's not really my style. Um, you could use it so it has a quick detach option on a rifle, but we worked with them to make sure they had a flip to side option so that when you're working on it, using it with a LPVO, it's perfect. It just functions smoothly, so we're happy with that. But then the other thing that we had that the other things that, or the other that so that's just kind of the main lesson from that one is that the charging handle on the PSA Jackal is in a very well thought out place. Moving up and moving into something a little bit more exciting. Put this up on the screen real quick just to let you know we're doing a pre-order. You notice the sunglasses, we're instead of going out to Amazon and buying a pair, for the now hiked up price, I think they tripled the cost already. You basically get one for free slash the original price if you pre-order one. So you can head over to our LLC.com and shirt there. Mm. The pre-order, like the giveaway, close on the 5th of January, and in celebration of whatever you wanna call it, on the 6th, we'll be announcing the winner. It's over $1,000 in that $1,000 of gear included in that giveaway. So, thanks, shout out to Signal Hill Supply for adding to the so-called loot pile. Now that's getting the business side out of the way. Let's get into something things that are going on in contemporary politics. Not even contemporary politics, but the term colonialism has become a bit of an eyesore in common conversation, and what we can learn from its use and its use as a term is that it means different things to different people. Kind of like when you encounter someone who refers to themselves as a communist and they don't like capitalism, you get them to describe capitalism, and all it is basic criminal activity, lying to people and taking advantage of them and so on and so forth. And so while you may give them the benefit of the doubt by saying that they're what they dislike is something like, the system that capitalism produces, you really end up finding out that, it's either a mixture of resentment or, misplaced, hatred that tends to be landed. Now, colonialism is another one of those terms that gets used a bunch, and it gets abused a bunch because colonialism depending on where you ask about it, means different things. To some people, colonialism simply means the expanse of European culture across the world, Judeo-Christian culture, where it might be anywhere where white people are present, where white people are normally not found, something goofy like that. Colonialism can mean some things like, going into an environment, going to a foreign country and taking over their economy with your system and replacing them with yours, replacing their values with yours or whatever. Uh, but the problem is, and the problem that we get to when we talk about colonialism is the same thing that we run into when we talk about a lot of these political problems. And that is that it's an extremely one-sided argument. It's an extremely one-sided argument. If you've probably heard this before. you've probably heard this phrase before that racism is prejudice plus power. And think of it, and that's it's a really good example of breaking down how the term colonialism is used in our contemporary world. I think I'm even at an angle. There we go. Let's fix that. So, colonialism has been a term that's been thrown around. It's almost used like a slur now, that's been used to attack people for many, many years. And what I want to do in this is kind of break down some of the problems, the philosophical problems with the use of the phrase colonialism, because it sort of it sort of ends up being something. It ends up being used something like a tool without a place, a weapon without a purpose, something without an aim. It's just it all it does is accomplish sort of a means to power type argument. And not only is that an issue, but it also has negative consequences because what you end up doing is either you create a system where more evil is accomplished than good, or you end up creating a problem where uh, you end up doing the exact same thing that you claim to be opposing, which in certain political systems is actually the purpose. The purpose is to accuse your opponent of what you're doing so that you can do it as well, and no one can blame you for it. This is Saul Alinsky, it's well documented, and it's become almost like a chess move in contemporary conversation regarding what Ho a chess move in forms of rhetoric. So if I accuse you of doing something and then I go do the thing myself, you can't really you can't really condemn me for it because you're already being investigated for doing the thing. And this is intentional and it's very effective, but is it moral? The answer is obviously no, but what do you do about it? So colonialism, let's start with the assumptions. This is gonna be kind of a political philosophy conversation. What are the assumptions when we talk about colonialism? Is that one people have a culture and another people have a culture, and those 2 cultures are not the same thing. They are entities of themselves. And one people are moving into another people's area to take advantage of their economy, their natural resources, and whatever, alter their culture in order to serve the first. Let's talk about the colonists in the most classic example of American colonists would be people in America. Colonists who came from Europe, they moved to America or the nation that is America, the landmass that we refer to as America, and they started bringing with it their own culture. So Christianity did not originate as a religion, did not originate in the Americas, and it was brought here by people traveling across the ocean. Okay, and that issue and they also brought their economy, they also brought their ability to use force, they brought their functions of government, they brought their concepts of property, and what you see here is something that people do when they move somewhere, whether they are displaced because of political issues, or they're displaced because of cultural issues, or they're displaced because of wars, maybe you call them refugees, whatever, you can't expect them to you can't always expect them to leave their home of origin and their years or generations of society and culture and commonly held beliefs and move to a new location because people are not a blank slate. They're not a tabula rasa. This is where we kind of go wrong in Enlightenment philosophy. Believe especially even in that argument, the tabula rasa problem, has an issue when you get people who are now moving and they're adults. You can't really claim the blank slate theory when you're dealing with adult people. So, people move from one nation to or one landmass, one country, one kingdom, one area to another area to, escape something, whether it's, religious wars, which all wars are fundamentally religious because they all center around some sort of moral framework, and the thing which dictates or determines morality is what is one's religion. And so that's a distraction. Let's get back to it. So when people are moving away and people are going to move. They're gonna be displaced by different things. Maybe it's let's use the example of Haiti, right? There's only so much natural resources that Haiti has. There are political problems, there are cultural problems. And so if somebody decides to move from Haiti to another place, if for economic benefit, is that considered colonization? No, we would consider that migration or something else. But colonization then has to do the colonization then runs on a line that has a very gray space that tends to create a problem, and that is, uh, when does a when does it become colonization? When does an action, a collective action become colonization? Is it when enough people move? Is it when enough culture is shifting from one place to another? When is it considered colonization? Can it be in a sense, following on the Ranger Doctrine sua sponte? Can it be all of their own accord? So if a entire group of people, let's just say from Germany, decided to get together, organize, without their government, not as a government entity, and all pick up and displace to Tibet, how how many people would it require for it to be considered colonization? Because those people are moving of their own accord. They're choosing of their own volition. They said, "Hey, we don't wanna live here anymore, we wanna live over there." And so they move to Tibet, and they figure out some things within the Tibetan structure, like, the ownership of property, maybe citizenship, maybe something like that. And then over time, they continue to grow and grow and grow and grow until there's a marked shift in the culture of Tibet with a very sort of German, aspect. We're gonna start talking about Minnesota here because Minnesota is the latest example of what colonization looks like. So, in that example, you had a group of people voluntarily pick up and move from Germany to Tibet, and then over generations, they built a German society within German expats who they follow they live according to Tibetan laws, generally speaking, but they build their own German culture into it. They build their own neighborhoods, and then because they're gonna live next to each other, I mean, it's a lot easier to live next to somebody that you at least speak the same language on, or you have some of that cultural connection to. But over time, they begin to alter the cultural landscape of Tibet. At what point in time would that be considered colonization? The reason why this is an issue and the reason why we talk about it is because it's what happens as people move, and it's what happens when people move to different areas. Like, it's sort of this you gotta zoom out so far to see that populations are gonna move and shift around, and you really get to start to see a lot about a person's worldview, because Minnesota is a good example. Minnesota was settled by early on, you had Native American populations, and then you had French people enter into the arena, and the French and the Native Americans had different types of relationships. Some of them were mutually beneficial, like the French fur trade, and then some of them were not as well, but we're not gonna get into that detail. Rather, after a time, then you had a lot of German families were moving, and Swedish families and Norwegian families started moving all into the Minnesota area until the and then and Dutch and Polish, to be clear. So you had this big population of, people within the state of Minnesota who had all these different types of heritages, all these different types of backgrounds. You had a little bit of Swedish here, a little bit of German here, a little bit of, even a little bit of French still. You had This is where you get places like New Ulm, and you get these little towns with their different names. But over time, those cultures, those communities continued to expand. Now, my grandfather moved to, his father was an immigrant from Sweden, and if I recall correctly, both his parents died on the ship, and so he came to America and ended up in Minnesota, basically, as an orphan, and, uh, created a bit of a life for himself, and then from there, more family moved in and more family moved in until and then they all lived a lot of them lived in the Swedish part of town. So, Swedish is a distinct culture, and you have all these different cultures moving into the Minnesota area, and they're kind of blending together with some success, some not success, and they're working together to try to figure out what the city what the state looks like, and so you get until you get to the 1980s and the 1990s, where a lot of us and so we were born into so I was born into Minnesota during a certain era of its existence, and it had a certain feel to it and a certain culture. There was the Midwestern nature where there's a little bit of passive aggressive going on, and there's the Minnesota nice thing. And over time, though, we've had different populations come in, and the reason why we're talking about this is because Minnesota is apparently there's some part of Minnesota that is looking at changing their flag, and then there's some controversy about whether it looks too much like this nation's flag or that nation's flag or whatever. And there's a certain how do you say it? There's a certain, pang of discontent that has risen to the surface, and that is the question of why is this happening to begin with? And what you end up asking yourself the question is, there's this debate in colonization or colonialism of who has rights to the land. Now, um, this is where I think culture is gonna have to come into play because what you have is you have these 2 extremes. One is this idea that you can go back to some arbitrary point in history where a certain group of people get to claim it as theirs. For example, how far into the future would we have to go until how far in the future would we have to go until Minnesota could be considered a Swedish state? I don't know. Is it gonna ever happen? Probably not. But on the one hand, you have to arbitrarily pick a point in time where a certain, say, culture of people lived in an area and claimed it as their own. The other option is to say whoever has the most representation there now, and both of those have a problem with kind of arbitrary issues. But what you find out with empires, as with people, is those who have the desire to live on, to live according to their values, end up carrying their values to the next generation. And if you wanna look at the flag as of Minnesota as this problem, you might wanna say something like, "Oh, well, Minnesota's being colonized by a foreign adversary," and certainly they have. I mean, 2020 was a really good example of it. The state was effectively colonized by an ideology that took it over, and then after the crime continued to rise and the population refused to come to terms with it, we can see the fulfillment of that form of colonization. Minnesota is a colonized state. It was colonized by a new ideology because if you think about it in the old way, colonization always looked not always, but the thing that we refer to colonization looked something like a bunch of people moving from one area to another, and that made sense in an era of nation states and kingdoms, where you would have things like the East India Trading Company, you'd have things like, the let's just even talk about the conquistadors, and you had all these different examples of kingdoms and nation states sending out people to other parts of the world, in some ways to build a market economy, like what England was trying to do, creating shipping and market lanes. And that's painting it in light, don't get me wrong, as well as, acquiring resources from different areas that they don't necessarily have themselves. And so there's a material aspect to it, and then there's a market aspect to it, and then there's gonna be a cultural. But that what that idea our idea of colonization is currently fixed in an era that only really belongs or that starts to no longer be cogent or accurate after, let's just say, the age of exploration, the turn of the century from 1800s to 1900s, because in the time following the Industrial Revolution, that second big Industrial Revolution, which was the early 1900s, the world got really small. As technology has increased, from steamships to different forms of locomotion to things like electricity, the telegram, the telephone, satellites, the internet, and so forth, now we have a different problem because if we were to contain this idea of colonization to what was relevant 120 years ago, then the only thing that we could really consider colonization would be something like mass migration. And mass migration would be, whether you're gonna talk whether you refer to things as, something that things that are going on at the southern border, you could call that colonization of sorts. You could or whether you're talking about the movement of refugees in massive bloom of Islam in European states. Those are things that in a very classic term might refer to as colonization. But what about what we're experiencing today, where you have institutions and organizations or institutions or concepts, let's talk about something like academia, that if you were to take the body of academia and you were to condense it into a plot of land and then place it somewhere in the world, you would have something that looks an awful lot like a nation state. You'd have something that looks an awful lot like a nation state. And if you were to then take that thing, this academia, and you were to send not necessarily envoys, but settlers in to go colonize academia, would we not to take over the nation of academia, or to extract resources, whether it's papers or whatever you wanna call it, would we not call that colonization? Another example would be a corporation. Is a cor The problem that we're dealing with one of the problems that we face in our world is that you might say, when you look through history, we might say that, uh, we there are different sort of phases different parts of history. Whether you're looking at let's just use, philosophy. There's there's ancient times, pre-modernity, modernity, and post-modernity. Now, postmodernism refers to a specific belief system, but post-modernity simply refers to the time after the modern after modernity, modernity, whatever. And modernity is oftentimes referred to as the Enlightenment. So, ancient in a timeline of history regarding philosophy, you have ancient, which is gonna be kind of the Greeks, up until, sort of the fall of the Roman Empire, and then you're gonna have pre-modern, which is what oftentimes gets referred to as the Dark Ages, which, as it turns out, were not nearly as dark as people describe them as. And then you had modernity, which sort of started around the Renaissance and carried on through the Enlightenment, but pretty much came to an end in the end of the 1800s, and pretty the with World War One sort of being loosely referred to as the nail in the coffin or the end of modernism, and then you had post-modernity, which would be 1920s, 1915, and onwards, 1920s and onward, and each of these different eras had different foundational concepts that determined that were commonly held amongst the people. I know we're talking about colonization and colonialism, but we're also gonna be talking we're getting into that subject. We gotta build some foundation here. So, in the history of philosophy, we've got the ancient times, Greeks and Romans. There's a lot to deal with that. It gets muddy, but hold on to me. And then you've got pre-modern, and the axiom of truth might be something like as determined by God, or it might be something like revelation. It might be something like the axiom of truth was something to do with what's the best way to describe the axiom in pre-modern? Um, it's sort of like the world outside the individual, that there is something that is more true than human perception. That would be probably the best way to describe pre-modern is that it's so the objective world is out there, and you are is the objective world exists, and there's sort of the sacred and the profane. The sacred being that there's some sort of ultimate truth, and then the profane is just whatever we exist in our mundane lives, or maybe the physical and the spiritual. This is kind of post-Platonic. But the that that division, pre-modernism, being the separation of the sacred and the profane, meaning there are things that are more true than what we are capable of perceiving, eventually was replaced with what became modernism. about through at the start secular or it would have been Christian humanism, which was a greater confidence in the rationalism, rationability, the rational abilities of the individual, of the human, rational. Am I pronouncing that wrong? Am I really stumbling through words? Yes. The rational abilities of the individual became or gained in confidence, and what it ended up doing is it kind of like an arc, it peaked in the Enlightenment where the idea, the generally held belief was that rationalism could solve all problems, that with enough human effort and thought, we could achieve some form of objective rea achieve some form of objective perception. We could see things exactly for what they are. The problem is that that kind of fell apart, and that fell apart pretty roughly in, around the time of World War One, and then what ended happening what you ended up with in this sort of post-rational era is that people no longer believed that objective reality was achievable or objective perception was achievable, and then subjective perspective took its place. It's kind of like if you build your worldview, everything that you believe on a set of axiomatic beliefs, and then you find out that they're not true, one of the greatest dangers that people face with when they do that is that they quickly try to fill that void with a bunch of stuff. And this is what you see when people leave cults is that eventually they come to believe or find the courage to leave a cult, and it's the danger for them is that they very quickly or very often quickly get wrapped up into another one, because they have established not only human characteristics or human, what do you call it, habits, a sense of security, a bit of a worldview, but they need to fill that with something else. You see this where people go from say like a Gnostic cult to a different Gnostic cult. They'll leave a fake version of Christianity that's very, very heavily wrapped around mysticism and very quickly replace that with some sort of government politics type of mysticism. It's probably the easiest example in our contemporary era. Stick with me. We're getting to the point on all this. And so as we've gone through culture and as we talked about kind of these philosophical eras, pre-modern, modern, postmodern, pre-modern being what is oftentimes referred to as the medieval period, modern oftentimes being referred to as the Enlightenment period, and then postmodern, which is what we're in now, sort of. Perhaps it's coming to an end rather stochastically, but, the primary components of each of these 3 different eras in the history of philosophy is that the pre-modern separated the sacred from the profane. That means there were sort of sacred truths and profane truths, and profane truths had to do with the world, whereas sacred truths had to do with things beyond just reality, and that those sacred truths had impact on the profane. And so you see a lot of classic philosophy come out of this era. Which should not be discarded because of the amount of writing and wisdom found in that time frame. Particularly, an example of what has, um, a particular, philosophical argument that somehow sort of didn't make it through there, but is an example of this, is that if you've heard of the problem of evil. If God exists and he is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good, how is it that evil exists in the world? Now, a person in our day and age might think themselves wise for asking this question. But what they're really revealing is that they're tragically unread in the pre-modern philosophers because various characters in this time frame spent hundreds of years writing about these kinds of issues. And what you find out is that the spiritualism that people talk about today, I'm spiritual but not religious in that phrase, is that they're just a pre-modern version of mystics. They believe in something, but they don't know what it is. And they believe in something that they don't want to, that they're struggling with identifying, because if they were to identify it, they'd be held to a standard. This is me being a little bit cynical about it. And so, if you want to answer questions like that, maybe a lot of the questions that have to do with meaning and direction, it's not uncommon for people to start looking in the pre-modern era. This is where you might see a little bit of what has become postmodern is now giving way to pre-modern in the sense that postmodernism has produced maximum individuality, but minimum meaning. Because if you can do whatever you want, if everything is up to you, you believe what you wanna believe, I believe what I wanna believe, and as long as we don't hurt each other, everything's hunky dory. Uh, the final end of that road is that it's all meaningless. It has no value. Final end of that road is nihilism, and then we have tragedies that probably the platforms we're talking on right now will not let me talk about, but they're like suicide and genocide. When you talk about how when people talk about how tragic and horrible the things like the Crusade, uh, you need to remember that maybe you might wanna describe the communist revolution in Russia as a crusade, or the Maoist revolution. Communism tends to function in a very crusading element. Perhaps it's another confession by projection issue, but we're gonna move away from that because it's not really the point. So in this pre-modern era, we had a lot to do with meaning and having to do with the real world, but it had a lot of pre-modern philosophy focused on things like the problem of the first mover, which was Avicenna and Ansel. But the problem with the first mover is everything has a cause. What is the first cause? I do an action and something caused that. I go back in time and something caused that, and I go back in time. Or another one is I have a father. My father has a father. He has a father. He had a father. He had a father. He had a father. What is the issue of the first father? Where did that come from? And you go back to the beginning of time, and this is the problem of the first mover. Just apply this concept to actions or any event, a philosophical event in history. Not philosophical event like the Enlightenment, but a philosophical event could be something as simple as movement, or concept, cause effect. Whereas so then when humanity, at least the West, transferred into the Enlightenment era, which wasn't quick. One of my favorite novels of all time, and I highly recommend you read it, would be Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Um, if you haven't read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite novels of all time. And if you have read it and you're thinking about reading it again, think of it when you're reading it, look at it as somebody writing a story about the transition from who or someone who is writing in the time of the transition from pre-modern to modern times. The per the in the beginning of the book, there's a heavy emphasis on religion. There's churches are mentioned and so on and so forth, but as the book moves on, you see a pretty marked transition between the function of religion and then this function of what would be considered natural philosophy, or what is called natural philosophy, but would be referred to as science. Natural philosophy, science is the same, more or less. There's there will be distinction, but not today. So I highly recommend reading the book Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Um, and so in the modern era, you saw a rise of rationalism, which rationalism focusing on what a person can come to through objective perception, through trial and error, the confidence in the individual's ability to perceive the world around him, make judgments, make evaluations. Some of the political philosophy that came out of that would have been utilitarianism, other issues. But as time moved on, rationalism peaked so high, like Icarus, flew too close to the sky that its wings melted and it fell into collapse. And this is one of the philosophical consequences of World War One. Philosophical consequence of World War One is that people had believed that if we were all enlightened, rational countries, how could we go to war against each other? But they did, to a great effect. And industrialization came to play when you saw the things like the machine gun, mustard gas, and the bomber. Suddenly, the Napoleonic era style of warfare died off because you couldn't do a horse charge into a machine gun. and then trench warfare and so on and so forth. So the massive death toll of World War One left a scar on sort of the psyche of the world, that could be marked as the death of rationalism. But what came to replace it? Personal expression. The problem is that the end of personal expression ad infinitum is suicide, because nothing has meaning, and this is something that we deal with today. So why am I talking about this? Well, in these eras, these philosophical eras, we also have political eras that have taken place because politics and philosophy go hand in hand. And early on, during that pre-Enlightenment, pre-modern era, we had this sort of political system called feudalism. Everyone knows what feudalism is. Not everyone, I mean, everyone, that sounds too derogatory. I apologize. But in the feudal era, you had divine rights of kings, which might have been a little bit overblown, but who knows? And you had challenges and debates and conflicts over of both authority and economy issues across the West. But during this era, the primary mode of government was feudalism, and the primary mode of you had a very like pre-modern market system, and eventually feudalism kind of expanded until you had kingdoms, like full-blown kingdoms, the French kingdom, you had the Habsburgs and the so long and so forth, but you had these kingdoms, and you had mercantilism starting. Mercantilism was or mercantilism wasn't quite like what we called capitalism, but it wasn't also, because it hadn't quite ascertained the ideas of the rights of man in the same way. But mercantilism still centered the financial dependency of the financial system around the kingdom, but there were also the ability to produce markets, and those spread around the world. And as kingdoms around the time of the French Revolution, kingdoms were falling away, nation states were taking place. This is where we see the first rise of what we call nationalism. And so as you see through time, you've got political philosophy, economic philosophy, and then basically governance all moving through time. As these things shift, they affect each other. And nation states, the idea of a nation, we are not servants of the French king, we are the French people, i.e., the French Revolution, marked a sharp change in the political philosophy of the average individual. But it also was affected by markets and how people moved through time, or how people moved and how they settled and how they thought of land and property and ownership. And then things like in Russia, you would see happen a couple hundred years later, which would be the freeing of the serfs and the ending of this kind of serfdom mentality, or sorry, the serfdom system. What we have in this idea and this challenge here is that as time has progressed, what would it look like if the age of the nation state is over? What will replace it? Right now, one of the biggest arguments would be the international corporation. The international corporation is kind of like a nation state during the time of kingdoms. It's a budding population. People have their own economy kind of within it. They have their own method of functioning within each other. They have their own support systems, and we're talking about massive companies, Amazon, and so forth. So, if colonization, which primarily took place during the time of the Enlightenment, from how we determine colonization. If colonization primarily took place and was defined during the time of the Enlightenment, when people moved from one nation state to another area to either establish a nation state or help kinda develop that area, and as a result, gained access to markets or created markets and changed the culture there because the culture in the area where they were colonizing was not yet a market economy. What you're seeing is you're seeing a direct movement. You're seeing a direct movement of people from a known entity, a nation state, to another area to develop it for some purpose. And maybe develop it is treating it too graciously, giving it too much grace. Um, but what they're also doing is they're transferring their own ideas, their own ideologies, their own beliefs, their own religions to some extent, their own values, their own laws, their own courts, their own concepts of the rights of man. You imagine an Englishman traveling to a place like the Solomon Islands and trying to develop not only a market for coconuts. I'm reading Adventure by Jack London right now. But if they were to try to develop they're trying to develop the land for the harvesting of coconuts, but also they brought with that an English system of law and governance. Is that which part is the colonization? Is it the market? Is it the government? Is it the culture? Now take that same concept, but replace the Solomon Islands and the English kingdom with a corporation and a government, or the other way around. You take a movement, an ideology, and a nation state, or a state like Minnesota. And so you have a collected belief system that moves into an area, takes over its resources, replaces its government with its own people, and then turns that state into a reflection of its values instead of a reflection of the values of the people who lived there beforehand. Is that colonization? And more importantly, for the citizens of Minnesota, and I'm gonna end up finding myself wrapped up into this as well, why is somebody else running your state? Why are you waiting for somebody else to save you kinda thing? And when you get into the Age of Empires, and I don't mean the video game because that's all it is, what it is, but when you get into this idea of worldviews, people who do not believe in their worldviews, who do not hold to their values, will be replaced by people who do. A kingdom, a nation state, an empire, or a corporation does not believe enough in its own existence will be replaced by somebody else. And the evidence is, myself being an ex-Minnesotan, is, seems to look like somebody other than Minnesotans is running Minnesota. They're changing their flags, they're changing their culture, they're changing the way that they live. And this comes down to an interesting problem. That is, all my life I've observed this political conversation being said about how, an election or a person or somebody's gonna change the world, change our country, change our nation. The country needs to become something else, so on and so forth. It needs to we need to return to Christ, we need to return to something. We need to return to, conservative values. And the implication is always that somebody else needs to do the work. I am guilty of this. But the implication is always that somebody else needs to do the work. If you live in Minnesota and you are capitulating to the gang of sorts that has taken over your state, then ask yourself if they want to be there more than you do, 'cause that's probably the hardest question. When we talk about colonization, we should look at the institutions that have built this country and ask ourselves which ones are being colonized and by whom. Because the academia, to some extent, many the criticisms against academia can very quickly be understood as that academia has been colonized by an anti-academic, anti-intellectual worldview, and the evidence is in the kind of material. Or another argument would be a certain worldview, a certain perspective has colonized much of the West. Um, look at what look at the displays that went on in the White House for Christmas this year. You had an organization that has been understood as racist was given the grounds to turn it into a minstrel show. We saw, what else the gay sex tape in the Senate floor. That's what colonization looks like, is when people inhabit your positions of authority without respecting it, but only using it for its power. And if you wanna know what colonization looks like in the 21st century, look no further than America. We are being colonized by something that does not fit the old model. The old model would be something like, well, the English flag is a representation of colonization. Now we have the trans flag or whatever it is. That is what colonization looks like in our day. If you do not believe in your values enough to withhold them within your culture will be colonized by somebody else's values, and it will not look like the colonization that took place in the 1600s and the 1700s. It's gonna look different today, but they will have the same effect. Your values will be replaced by somebody else's, um, and that's the world that we live in. But it's also a call to action. Because when you look at the world of empires, an empire that no longer believes in its own existence will disappear, and it will create a void, and a new empire. The idea that there can be a world without governments and countries and people does is not a real idea. This is where the anarchists fall apart. This is where the Boogaloo Boys fell apart. Is like, oh, this whole anarchism thing. It always falls apart because um, it's so easy to defeat. It's so easy to defeat this idea of anarchism because all you need to do is give people something to live for, and anarchism, um, they will coalesce around an idea, a worldview, or whatever. Government in introductions of people. So, in the world of empires, in the world that we live in that has empires and great countries, we may talk about the decline of the West. And it is my observation that the West is declining because it no longer desires to be alive, no longer desires to continue on. Not because not because it's being taken out, not because it's being attacked, because anything that exists will have to contend with reality, but because it no longer believes in itself. The West is being colonized by an ideology that believes in what it believes. Multiculturalism has become is the example of the axe cutting down the tree, clearing the way for something else to come in and take the place of your values, take the place of your community, your culture, your environment. So that's what we're doing. We're building. We had a, we are going that's what you see in this world. Now, sure, there's gonna be examples of cringe-worthy jokes, but we build. We believe in what we believe, and we live it out. We choose what is right and true and good, and we pursue it. And so, there was a question that was asked a long time ago. It's a question that I had that came out was, "What is the difference between a child and an adult?" You know, with the perpetual what do you call it? Um How do you call you might wanna call it the dumbing down of America. That's not the right way. With the perpetual like, you see these you see that you can see it does not take I do not recommend making a lifestyle of it, but you can go out and look around and see people who act like children, adults who act like children. The infantilization of the adult population in this country. Um, it's not really a surprise. What is the difference between a child and an adult? We might look for things, we oftentimes look for lines of demarcation, something like a rite of passage or a transition from a childhood to an adulthood. We might talk about the age of accountability. At a certain age, a person becomes accountable for their actions at all time completely. You might look at these kind of things. I think in any way that you look at it, the line of demarcation between childhood and adulthood isn't always clean. But the thing that starts as a child and ends as an adult starts as somebody who must ask for permission and ends with somebody who takes responsibility for their actions, who chooses to act and bears the consequence of it, fruit and otherwise, good and otherwise. Whereas a child is protected from the consequences of some of his actions, and he's also protected from some of the actions that he could take. But the line of demarcation between a child and adult is agency. And when you see people who act like children, the thing that should be the most, let's call it offensive, is when they are protected from the consequences of their actions. So, we covered a lot of material today. This is a bit of a live stream, is a bit of a test, coming off of a busy weekend. But I wanna thank you all for jumping on. I think Instagram's gonna drop off here in a second because they only let us stream for an hour. I wanted to try it. We wanted to give it a shot. If this is your first time jumping on, thank you for listening. The the main takeaway, wrapping this all up together, is colonization is a difficult problem because you are either expanding your culture or it is being consumed by somebody else. You either believe in what you believe, don't believe it enough, and so that somebody who does believe in what they believe will take your, and we see this happening in real time around us. So this is not a this is it's kind of like, it's funny. I don't need to give you permission, but this is a call to action. If you have values, live them, share them with your peoples, carry on. If you're downtrodden at the colonization of the West, realize that it only happens as we ourselves continue to capitulate to it. It doesn't create a solution, it's the solution. We build our culture, we don't ask for permission because who are you gonna ask? The multicultural? Like, you think the world out there is gonna give you permission to do what you think is right? No, it has consequences. But thank you for listening. We need to do some more but I'm trying to get better at I'm playing with this whole live streaming thing because it's exciting. Who knew that you could live stream a philosophical conversation and make something out of it? Today's day and age is an interesting time to be alive. We will see you soon. Important things to remember. The store is going to close this coming Saturday, the 23rd. We're gonna close the store on the 23rd. The only thing that will remain open on the store is going to be the pre-order. Let's bring it up on the screen. The only thing that's gonna stay open on the store is gonna be the pre-order because that closes on January 5th. The pre-order does include a pair of the shades. As soon as or we decided to put a shirt out because I want to win the culture war on this. We are gonna win the culture war when it comes to this movie called The Civil War, and we're gonna do it one way or another. We are either going to beat them at their game, or we are going to turn their slings into kindling for our fire. The shirt that you see listed does come with a pair of the shades, and the shades are not priced from where we got them, so that you don't have to worry about people price gouging on, Amazon or whatever. But the pre-order runs through January 5th. If you wanna head over to redactedllc.com, that's where you can find them. If you wanna support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com, where we focus on culture building, philosophy, and understanding how violence comes to play in our moral systems. That being the case, we'll talk to you soon. Go forth and conquer.